Hello, I'm Kathleen Olive, and I'd like to introduce you to Limelight Arts Travels Tour, Italy's Renaissance Courts. This tour is a movable feast in more ways than one. It's certainly a feast of art and architecture, particularly of the Renaissance, so particularly from the 15th to the 16th centuries, but also just of Italian art and architecture more generally. This is an extraordinarily wealthy region of northern Italy when it comes to that heritage of artistic treasures. But it's also a movable feast because it's often quite difficult to line up accommodation bases in this part of Italy in any kind of an ideal order. This is a part of Italy, northern Italy, is a place where in the 20th century industrialization happened quite quickly. And as a result, a lot of the bigger towns in northern Italy, the ones that would make for the best accommodation bases, are often given over to trade fairs. So to line accommodation up in any kind of ideal order becomes really difficult. And for that reason, the tour is also a movable feast because the components can move around somewhat in terms of what order we see things in, what kind of structural logic there is to the tour. We begin, however, in Bologna. Bologna is the first major city that you come to after you cross the Apennines, traveling north from, say, Rome to Milan. And so it's been quite a strategically important place for a long time. It's right at the beginning of the long plain that stretches all the way to the Italian Alps, more or less, a plain that really is formed around the valley of the Po River and then over towards the Adriatic coast, the great delta of the Po River Valley as well. And Bologna was settled in early times by a kind of pre-Etruscan population, the so-called Villanovans. It was also an important centre for the Etruscans as well. But then under Rome, it becomes a really strategic base, a place for coordinating roads and the traffic of people and ideas from northern Italy and northern Europe down towards Rome itself. And for this reason, unsurprisingly, it's also the place where the ancient University of Bologna grows as well. And alongside the university, which is a place originally for the investigation of canon law, it's in order to train lawyers who are going to defend the position of the popes in the endlessly unfolding debate between the temporal rulers, kings and emperors of Western Europe, and the religious ruler or pope, who is also, we should say, a temporal ruler as well. So Bologna as a university town grows up really as a part of that ongoing debate. But it's actually also a centre for wool processing in the Middle Ages, one of the most important centres for wool processing in all of central northern Italy, after places like Florence, for example, or the Arno River Valley. So this is why Bologna's medieval aspect is so well preserved, from the streets of its university quarters to the kind of medieval core that constitutes the centre of the city. And some of that is harder to visualise. In the Middle Ages, Bologna was really riven by factional strife and infighting. It was covered in the kinds of medieval defensive towers that we associate with places like San Gimignano in Tuscany. So that it's harder to recover that kind of aspect of Bologna's medieval history. But for the most part, the town presents us with a very medieval aspect. We have the now World Heritage listed porticos or covered walkways of Bologna, which emerges really a kind of land grab by private families looking to put on upper levels to their building and offering a covered walkway to the city as a kind of a begrudging quid pro quo as well. But Bologna is also a city that from the Middle Ages has a very strong, important role to play with respect to the church, as I've said, and it also has some very ancient and beautiful complexes of medieval churches, such as the one you see in this image, which is a complex of churches dedicated overall to St. Stephen. This is Santo Stefano, but it's more collectively known as Holy Jerusalem or Santo Gerusalemme, because within this complex of small interconnected churches, what Bologna was seeking to do was represent in a physical form in Bologna, the complex of churches that built up around the Holy Sepulchre of Christ in Jerusalem itself. So it's a little transportation of the city of Jerusalem into the medieval city centre of Bologna, just one of the kind of medieval jewels of Bologna, alongside other places like the basilica that grew up around the resting place of someone like St. Dominic, for example. In the modern era, Bologna is associated with a particular tradition of art that arises in modern Italy. It becomes a real hotbed for continued political discussion, has a reputation as being the most left-leaning city in Italy in the run-up to and then following World War II down to the present. Just one of the reasons why it's sometimes nicknamed La Città Rossa, Bologna Rossa, the red city, partly for its terracotta roof tiles, but also because of that left-leaning association that the city has had. And as a centre for modern art, the University of Bologna and the art schools of Bologna give rise to great art critics, people like Roberto Longhi, who's single-handedly responsible for reviving the reputations of artists as varied as Caravaggio and Artemisia Gentileschi, for example. Also great figures of the modern Italian landscape, like Pasolini, for example, who goes through art school in Bologna at the university, but also great teachers of art who are themselves practicing artists. So there I'm thinking of the Bolognese artist par excellence, and that's Giorgio Morandi, whose studio bedroom you see here in his house in central Bologna, which we'll visit. So Bologna in some ways is an introduction to the themes of the tour from us, a transition from a medieval world down into some idea of modernity, which Western Europe has often tended to locate as arriving with that moment of the Italian Renaissance. That's an idea we'll think about while we're on this journey together. In what ways does the Renaissance herald a modern age, as it's often said to have done? But before we go forward in time, we'll go back in time to understand why this region of Italy is so culturally rich for such a long period of time. And there's perhaps no better place to do that than Ravenna, which you see circled in green on the map here. Ravenna has a patchwork of a political history from about the 1st century all the way through to, well, the 6th or the 7th century. Ravenna at various times is a Roman capital. It's a capital of the Western Roman Empire. It's a capital for the Lombards. It's a capital for the Byzantines, the Romans over in Constantinople. It's a capital for the Frankish Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. Ravenna is a city that changes political stripe so rapidly over a period of about 500 or 600 years. And what we see in places that are strategically important, commercially important, is that they also become, and this is the case in Ravenna, culturally important as well. All of those rulers, they want to make an imprint, make their mark, and leave something to the community and to the region more widely. And when we're looking at political capitals in this period of Western Europe's history, so particularly say from the, let's say, 4th century to the 7th century, something that really characterizes the political rulers of that time is their need to promulgate Christianity, first of all, as a coherent, rational, comprehensible religious structure. You know, it's relatively recent. It's a new introduction in this period, and it's something that has to be made sense of still to a body of believers. So that's one aspect of what Christian rulers in Ravenna need to do. But the other thing that Christian rulers in Ravenna need to do, from Romans to Byzantines to Goths and so forth, is that they also need to use Christianity as a form of state power, a language for talking about their own rule, their own ideas, their own mandate. Early Christianity, quite quickly becomes apparent that it's a really good language of power. And so Ravenna is a place where we see Christianity as a new kind of belief system, but also in that cultural sense as a language of power, really being made manifest by subsequent generations of its rulers. And perhaps the most beautiful monuments of Ravenna that give us a demonstration of that are those left by the Byzantine rulers of Ravenna. So from the 6th century, when the Romans, who are still continuing on the great Roman Empire just to the east of the Mediterranean in Constantinople, we refer to them as the Byzantines, they set out to take much of the Italian peninsula back from the so-called barbarian Gothic rulers who had captured it. And that really happens under the Emperor Justinian. So after the conquest of Justinian, reconquest by Justinian and his general Belisarius of the Italian peninsula, many Christian monuments in Ravenna are rebuilt as a way of demonstrating the power of that Roman Christian Byzantine emperor and his state. And these are the World Heritage listed Christian monuments of Ravenna that are entirely covered in the style of glass gold crowned mosaics favored in the Byzantine Empire. So here you're looking at, in fact, an earlier monument of Ravenna. This doesn't date from the Byzantine period of Ravenna. It's just before that, when Ravenna was still a capital of the Western Roman Empire, hadn't been conquered by the Goths yet. And this is the so-called mausoleum of Galla Placidia. As the daughter of an emperor, the mother of an emperor, the sister of an emperor, but the wife of a Gothic ruler, Galla Placidia is perhaps the best indication of just how complex the early political history of Ravenna is. But her supposed mausoleum, she's not actually buried here, but we call this her mausoleum. It's one of also the best examples of just how luxurious, just how sophisticated, just how complex the artistic legacy of Ravenna is, something that came down to us in the modern age because its importance was always known, because the bombs of World War II just narrowly missed destroying a lot of these monuments, but also it must be said because politically in the modern era, Ravenna really ceased to be a particularly important place. So there was no drive to industrialize this part of the town. There was no drive to knock down these extraordinary monuments. Thank goodness, because it does mean that Ravenna is possibly the best place to see the Byzantine mosaic style in all of Europe. From Ravenna, we continue to travel north and we travel to Padua. Padua was a court in the Middle Ages in one way or another. It tries to set itself up as a place for self-rule, what we would call a commune, a place where the citizens, very limited group of people, but the wealthy mercantile citizens of Padua do try to set the town up in the Middle Ages as a place for self-government, but they're not particularly successful. And by the 14th century, Padua has fallen under the rule of Venice. It's one of the first mainland possessions of the Empire of Venice once it turns its focus from conquering the seas to its east and turns its focus to conquering mainland territory to the west to feed its ever-growing population. And Padua is one of the first major conquests of the Empire Maritime, until that point, Maritime Empire of Venice. But Padua also has, like Bologna, a very proud Roman history. It also has, like Bologna, a university, a place for the exchange of ideas. And these things guaranteed that, in fact, Padua becomes a centre for artistic experimentation and innovation in a way that will actually give rise to some of the later developments of Renaissance Italy that we look at. So while Padua isn't famous for being a Renaissance centre of Italy, the importance that it has as a medieval centre in northern Italy is connected to the developments of the Renaissance that follow. We can attribute these to a certain number of things. We can attribute, in fact, these developments to the importance of pilgrimage to the city of Padua. Padua is a resting place of a still very popular saint, St. Anthony. And because of the huge basilica that is dedicated to his final resting place, great artists are called from all around Italy to come and leave works of art there. Artists like Donatello, without whom we don't see the later development of artists such as Mantegna, who's trained in Padua in the 15th century in a style that has owes much of a debt to the work done by Donatello as a sculptor in Padua. So here you see Donatello's equestrian sculpture of a great Italian military warlord, a man nicknamed Gatta Melata, or Honey Cat, as this sculpture in bronze is known, one of the first major equestrian monuments in bronze of the Renaissance, and something that kicks off a whole tradition of Renaissance art making. The other important Renaissance development in the city of Padua, of course, orbits around its university. Those are scientific developments, from study being undertaken into botanics, with one of the first botanic gardens in all of Europe. We also see developments in the 16th and 17th century thanks to the scientific investigations of people teaching at the university. I'm thinking of people like Galileo Galilei. So here you have a reconstruction of the extraordinary anatomical theatre that we'll visit at the University of Padua, for example, something that was a tiny, tiny little space designed to give the best scientific examination possible of the very few cadavers that could be dissected for scientific purposes. But of course, one of the crowning achievements in medieval Padua that will have such an impact on the development of Renaissance art in Italy is the so-called Scrivegni Chapel, the private chapel of Enrico Scrivegni, a very wealthy and reasonably powerful local banker who entirely subsidizes a private family chapel and its decoration by one great artist, and that is the artist Giotto di Bondone from Tuscany. We tend to associate him with the great artistic developments of Florence, but in fact, this work of his, which he executes in Padua in about 1305 to 1308, is the best preserved and most complete example of the work of Giotto. It is, I would say, the most beautiful surviving work of Giotto. Its technique is the most flawless. Its preservation, despite a really difficult subsequent history for this building in terms of the fabric of the building itself, nevertheless, this cycle of frescoes by Giotto in his workshop is one of the best preserved works of Giotto that we have. And also in terms of the work of Giotto, this is the one in which we can see he had the most to do. So he did the most work in designing, in planning, and in governing the execution of these frescoes. He didn't set this work up for his assistants to complete while he went off and did some other things, which is something that was very common for masters in the Renaissance. But here Giotto stays, and he gives the whole weight of his focus and attention and skill to this cycle. Visiting this cycle of frescoes by Giotto, for me, is one of the highlights of this tour. It's something that gives us the clearest understanding we can have of how suddenly in the 14th century, Italian art takes a decisive new turn and gives us some of the developments that will lead to the great masterpieces we see on the rest of this tour. From Padua, we travel back south. So we head south again and we travel towards the region of Le Marche in the southern part of northern Italy. And we make a stop on the way in the Po River Delta to visit the Abbey of Pomposa. This is a really convenient place to break our journey, essentially. It's a good place to use the facilities and have lunch, which is the local specialty known as piadina, really tasty stuffed flatbreads that are then done in what we would just call a sandwich press, but very, very simple, but very, very tasty. But Pomposa on the Po River Delta had a much greater significance in the Middle Ages. It's one of the earliest and largest Benedictine institutions, big monastic complexes in this part of Italy. In the 10th and 11th centuries, it was a place where a reformed notion of how Christians should work and pray, that's the creed of the Benedictines, was really redeveloped, was used to then kind of spread a benign influence over the surrounding countryside with the maintenance of roads for travellers, with the bonification, as it's called in Italy, the draining of land and better agricultural techniques for the peasants of the surrounding territory, and also for some really important, some very significant philosophical considerations, ranging from theological discussions to artistic debate about how best to teach Christians a reformed Christian message in art, so wonderful cycles of frescoes such as we see in the Abbey Church of Pomposa. But this was also the place where in about the year 1013, a monk from Arezzo originally, he's known as Guido d'Arezzo, came here and also formulated in a much more scientific and intellectually clear way how we could set out musical notation so that songs could be chanted and played in the same way, in a way that could be understood by everyone using a new kind of shorthand. And that was, in fact, the basis for Western musical notation as we know it today. So that was actually formulated in this little abbey church, refined by Guido d'Arezzo, building on scholarship of those who had gone before him, and really for him a way to control in a regulated way Christian song throughout Benedictine communities such as his own, but which would of course go on to give us some really outstanding achievements of the Western canon. So tiny little Pomposa in the Sleepy Po River Delta is the place where usually the emergence of Western musical notation is fixed. After that interesting break in Pomposa, we continue south, however, to the city of Urbino. Urbino is the first real Renaissance court that we visit on this tour. It really, before the 15th century, is not very much. It's just a collection of humble villages clinging to an outcrop in a remote but strategic mountain pass in central northern Italy. But from the 15th century, it becomes the purview of a local family known as the Montefeltro family, specifically a member of that family called Federico da Montefeltro, who has made a huge fortune for himself as a military strategist and captain, or condottiero, as they were called. And he's able to invest that money back into the city of Urbino, turning it into a tax haven for its citizens, but also to invest in the cultural things that he felt were the necessary complement to his life as an active military strategist. So in the 15th century, thanks to the study of ancient texts, Roman, but also increasingly Greek ones as well, great thinkers and patrons like Federico strive to balance two aspects of their life: the active dimension of their life, the things that they do, and the contemplative or more passive aspects of their life, the way that they think and the kinds of cultural achievements like buildings and artworks that they leave behind them. And Federico amasses such a fortune and has such carte blanche really in this town. He has so much control over the town of Urbino that he is able to refashion it to an ideal little courtly society that orients around him and subsequent ruling members of his family. So much so that, in fact, the whole formulation of what it means to be a courtier, an attendant in one of these Italian Renaissance courts, is formulated in this very palace by a person, a thinker called Baldassare Castiglione, who writes the very famous Book of the Courtier while spending time in Urbino at the court set up some generations prior by Federico himself. Federico is an extraordinary patron of architecture, as you see in this view of the Palazzo Ducale of Urbino. He's also an extraordinary patron of the arts, like some of the other patrons we'll see in northern Italy, particularly in Ferrara. He has a real taste for Flemish art, so he brings into this tiny town in the remote mountains of the Marche, the Marches, He brings great artists like Justus of Utens, for example. He brings artists who are greatly inspired by Flemish painters, so people like Piero della Francesca, who spend time either working in Urbino or sending to Urbino great works. There's much debate about that. For example, we'll see in Urbino probably Piero's most important and most enigmatic masterpiece, his so-called Flagellation of Christ, which you see here, a very unusual, very small, very carefully designed, but complex and almost confusing painting that we'll see when we're in Urbino. But he also has the entire palace set up to reflect those considerations that he has as a man of thought and ideas as much as he is a man of action. And we particularly see that made manifest in Urbino in his stunning and small studiolo. This isn't a study in the traditional sense of the word. Federico wasn't going to sit in here and, read books and take notes. He stored in this tiny little room all of the things that he used for his life of contemplation, his precious scientific instruments like astrolabes, his most precious books. He had the largest library in all of Italy in the 15th century, much larger than the Pope or the Medici in Florence. So he certainly couldn't have stored all of his books in this room. But it was a room really created for thought and for contemplation and for storing some of the things necessary for that. It was entirely panelled in intarsia woodwork in its lower register, as you can see here. That was designed and made in Florence by the Damiano woodwork shop and then sent to Urbino to be installed. You can imagine the precision measurements that were required to do that. Extraordinary trompe-l'oeil work in inlaid wood that gives the idea of it being a multi-dimensional space, but that's just flat wood paneling. And then up above, paintings done by some wonderful artists, Flemish artists, and in fact, Catalan artists traveling with those Flemish artists, a cycle of lives of illustrious men, portraits of men who were great thinkers for the most part. Some of them thinkers back in time, Thomas Aquinas, for example, Augustine of Hippo, but some of them people that Federico himself knew and admired, from contemporary popes to, in fact, his own school teacher, Vittorino da Feltre. Urbino is an amazing place. It's so hard not to think of it as a fairy tale kingdom, but it really is a kind of Renaissance fairy tale come to life. And on one of our days exploring the countryside around Urbino, you'll see other dimensions of that as well. So this is the Forte di San Leo. This is a fortress built in the real territorial homeland of the Montefeltro dynasty in the 15th century under the rule of Federico. This fort was built by a great military engineer, Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who worked out how this little rocky outcrop could be entirely fortified to defend it from the depredations of, in fact, Federico's greatest enemy. And Federico's greatest enemy came from Rimini. His name was Sigismondo Malatesta. Malatesta was the name of his family dynasty. And the Malatesta and the Montefeltro had been at one another's throats for a couple of generations by the time we get to Federico and Sigismondo. Sigismondo's base then was in the originally Roman town of Rimini on the Adriatic coast, which you see circled on the map here. Like Federico, Sigismondo makes his fortune, makes his way in the world as a military captain. Unlike Federico, who has the approval and the legitimation of the popes to hold the territory that he does, Sigismondo has the extreme disapproval of the papacy and is seen as a warmongering criminal. He has a terrible modern reputation as a result of that. A pope of the time, Pius V, does an extraordinary hatchet job on Sigismondo Malatesta that continues to this day. He calls him a wife murderer. He calls him someone who engages in incest. He says he's the devil incarnate and that just the thought of him frightens the Pope. So poor Sigismondo Malatesta has a terrible modern reputation, but he was in his own way as well as educated as Federico da Montefeltro and just as interested in building the active and contemplative dimensions of his person. So in that kind of search to become the true universal man, or what we would call Renaissance man, someone holding those two things in balance. And like Federico, he's also a great patron of art and architecture in somewhat of a different style. So we'll visit Rimini after we leave Urbino and head back north to conclude the tour. We'll stop off in Rimini, where we'll primarily visit the so-called Malatestian Temple. This is a basilica dedicated to St. Francis that Sigismondo Malatesta has rebuilt in his lifetime as a family mausoleum. He has the great architect Leon Battista Alberti, who we'll encounter quite a few times on our tour. We'll meet him again thanks to work that he designs for the city of Mantua. Here he designs the architecture for the unfinished Malatestian temple facade, itself designed after a temple, as I think you can see. And inside we'll find a reasonably compromised work by Piero della Francesca, but a whole cycle of extraordinary, beautiful low relief carving in stone, which is the work of Agostino di Duccio, one of the best pupils of the sculptor Donatello. I think you can see that here by the quality of this beautiful, highly symbolic, highly intellectualized work of Agostino di Duccio's in Rimini. And Agostino di Duccio is really remembered primarily for this whole complex of carvings that he does for the Malatestian temple in Rimini, and also because Donatello complains that he's a thief. So Donatello says that when Agostino di Duccio takes off to Rimini to do this work, he takes with him money from Donatello's workshop. Really seems to be a bit of a lover's tiff that they haven't been able to solve without going to the law courts. After our brief stop in Rimini, we continue north, and our next base will be in the town of Mantua. Mantua and Ferrara, the two main focuses of the last part of our tour, are, like Urbino and Rimini, some of the most important trend-setting courts of the 15th and 16th century in Italy. The 15th and 16th century are really the moment in which we encounter these great courts in Rimini, in Urbino, in Mantua, and in Ferrara, because all of them, by the time we get to the 16th century, by the end of that century, all of them have had problems, either with hereditary succession, so they're unable to establish a strong family name to continue after them. That's the case in Urbino and Mantua. Or they just get swallowed up in the greater political problems of the Italian peninsula in the 16th century. It's a really heady time known as the Italian Wars. It's when the French and the Spanish and the Pope are fighting with their various allies for ultimate control of the Italian peninsula. And so this moment of the Italian courtly city is brief and glorious, but it does pass away because of those greater political movements in central northern Italy. Mantua is a town that gave rise to some great intellectual figures of Italian history, people like Virgil, for example, but it was also constantly plagued with problems like malaria and marshiness, and it doesn't really resolve those until the 15th century, when a local family of military strategists, and maybe you can hear how that's a little bit of a constant in the Renaissance courts we're looking at, the Gonzaga family, managed to take rule of what until then had been a self-governing city and make it their own dynastic preserve. And when they do that, they're able to embark, thanks to their money from warmongering, basically, they're able to embark on some big engineering projects that help to solve some of those problems with standing water. They create a system of man-made lakes around the town that really mean that Mantua today is this very beautiful lakeside town surrounded on really 3 of its 4 sides by water, and with quite a sweet little system of canals and streams that run through the town as well, as you can see here. What you can also see here is the kind of political and then architectural and artistic genesis of the city over those successive generations of the Gonzaga family. From the earliest medieval palace that is really a fort, as you can see, with moats at the right. That's the key castle of St. George, which is the key heart of the Gonzaga family palace, moving out across the left of our screen to more Renaissance, open, classically inspired palaces of the later generations of the Gonzaga family, who transform the city over 2 generations. And we'll see that transformation of the city from the late 15th century in the key heart of the family ducal palace that we just saw on the previous image, the extraordinary so-called bridegroom's chamber, or Camera degli Sposi, more properly known as the Camera Picta, or painted chamber. This was painted in the last decades of the 15th century by the court artist Andrea Mantegna, whom I mentioned earlier. He trained in Padua, really refined his career in Venice, but then ends up in Mantua as court artist as a way to sustain his really large family. And he paints these extraordinary frescoes that show us the wealth and power and sophistication, but also some of the psychological and practical concerns of the ruling dynasty of the Gonzaga in Mantua at the end of the 15th century. But as I said, 2 generations later, the family's status has started to change. It's been bolstered intellectually by the arrival of great patrons like Isabella d'Este, who marries into the Gonzaga family, but is then dissolved in some ways by the relative ease and laziness and indolence of the generation that she gives birth to. And we see that particularly in the very beautiful, but ultimately quite fatuous, I suppose we could say, Palazzo Tè, or Palace of the Tea. That's the shape, not the beverage, which is constructed in Mantua, just on the outskirts of town, as a suburban pleasure palace by the son of Isabella d'Este. It's a place for him to enjoy the company of his mistress. And it's a sign, I suppose, of how far those Renaissance courts travel in just a few generations from their roots. They are still great patrons of the arts and architecture, as you see here in this wonderful room showing the clash of the Titans, entirely designed and executed by the artist Giulio Romano and his workshop. Giulio Romano is the greatest follower of Raphael, and he finds success in the court of Mantua, particularly in the designs that he executes for both the architecture and the decoration of that Palazzo Tè. But it's a long way from the early militaristic roots that allowed these Renaissance courts to form and to be strong. And it's something that in Mantua will be undone in the 17th century thanks to problems of succession. And most of the great movable artworks of Renaissance Mantua will be dispersed and sold as part of the War of the Mantuan Succession. Many of them end up in the collection of Charles I in England, from where they will be subsequently dispersed after his own demise. So the history of the material objects of Mantua in the 17th century and beyond is itself also very interesting. But Mantua's closest neighbour in terms of cultural prominence is the final Renaissance court, or maybe penultimate Renaissance court technically, that we see on our tour, and that is the city of Ferrara, where the ruling dynasty, the Este family, also emerge as local overlords who manage to exercise political and economic control over a self-governing city-state and turn it instead into their personal preserve. Again, in the very fabric of the city, we see that development from the early palace of the family with its moats and its towers, so fortified, so strong, something that tells you, I think, a little bit about the early preoccupations of these courtly dynasties, that they have to shore up rule and really consolidate their power in the town. So at the center of the city, this almost fairy tale fortified castle, something that really exercises a hold on the imagination of 20th century artists in Ferrara, who range from painters like Filippo de Pisis through to filmmakers like Michelangelo Antonioni, and who are perhaps most embodied in the local painter Giorgio de Chirico, who in fact gives us views of this castle in his own inimitable, surreal way. In various early works of his. So we have the Este and Ferrara as an early dynasty concerned to hold on to their rule, but by the middle of the 15th century, the Este and Ferrara are actually the most trend-setting courtly patrons in all of central northern Italy. What they invest and how they invest in art and architecture far outstrips what Federico da Montefeltro will achieve just a little after them in Urbino. And that's because they're really, really interested in the art and architecture of the North, particularly what we would call Flemish artists or artists coming out of the territories associated with the Kingdom of Burgundy or the Duchy of Burgundy, which was the most luxurious, the most innovative centre for art and decorative art in Europe, Western Europe, in the early parts of the 15th century. And the Este and Ferrara, they have a taste for that. So they have a taste for the work of Jan van Eyck, of Roger van der Weyden. They encourage these artists to come to Italy, to come to Ferrara, and kick off whole new trajectories for Italian art, from new media such as oil painting to new styles, which we see reflected in the local artists who follow on in the second half of the 15th century. That's artists like Cosme Tura, or Ercole dei Roberti, or Francesco del Cossa, three artists that you might be less familiar with, but whose work really emerges in Ferrara and who we'll see concentrated in a particular room, which is the so-called Hall of the Months. You see a view of it here in one of the many Este pleasure palaces, or delizie, as they're collectively known, delights of the Este. This one is the Palazzo Schifanoia in Ferrara, the palace in which you chase away cares, chase away boredom. That's the name of this particular palace, beautifully evoked in a very curious novel of the 20th century, 21st century, actually, when I think about the date of publication. That's the novel How to Be Both by the British writer Ali Smith, something that really evokes Ferrara in interesting and challenging ways. I said Ferrara was the last Renaissance court that we visit, but then I corrected myself and said it was the penultimate, because technically where we end our tour is on Lake Garda in the lovely little town of Sirmione, and then with a cruise around the lake on a private boat. And technically, Sirmione is also an early Renaissance court. It's a stretch, but I think I can make it. Sirmione on Lake Garda is a beautiful little fortified town, also with very ancient Roman origins. The Romans loved Lake Garda just as much as the Germans do today. But Sirmione was encastellated. It was a fortified harbour and arsenal, a shipyard, military shipyard for the local courtly ruling dynasty of the Scala family from Verona. So this is the Scaligeri fortress and fortified harbour on the tiny little town of Sirmione. It's on the end of a promontory that juts out into Lake Garda. As you can see today, it's a very pretty and pleasant place to stroll and appreciate the beauty of Lake Garda, which is what we'll be doing on the final day of our tour. But again, when you look at it, it too encapsulates the trajectories of these towns in northern Italy, this fascinating movement that they make from military strongholds to centres of power, and also soft power as well. So the kind of extraordinary cultural capital that we see amassed in central northern Italy in places like Urbino, Mantua and Ferrara, of art, of architecture, and also of ideas. Thanks very much.